Ladies and gentlemen, are games going to be distributed digitally in the future, or are they going to be on a disc-based medium? Well, in this Red Gaming Tech.com video, we're going to be discussing this. According to Sony, in a recent interview, they have said most gamers don't want to buy online right now. This was said in an interview with Games Industry International, and they sat down with the Senior Vice President of Sony Computer Entertainment, and his name, by the way, is Guy Longsworth, and he said that quite clearly gamers just want discs right now. That's what most gamers want. I'll read you guys out the interview. I just joined the company just under 2 years ago, and I'm relatively new to gaming industry. It's just a phenomenal industry to be in. I literally go to bed every day, and I can't believe how lucky I am at what I do. End quote for a second. By the way, guys, I am suffering a little bit with hay fever right now, so if my voice goes a bit funny or whatever, it's because I'm like, tickly nose. I can only apologise. I can't do anything about it. I have taken medicine and all of that. It is a bitch. Anyway, continuing. We knew that it was a very important moment for our company, so we spent a huge amount of time preparing for it, as you can imagine. He, by the way, is talking about the E3 event. The team who actually executed and put on the production, I just think, are the best in the business. I've never seen anything like it in my career. Our strategy has been set for some time. It's not our job to talk about the competition. We're here to tell you what we stand for, and Jack Tretton very clearly told you where we stand. We think that that's the right thing for gamers. We think that's the right thing for our platform, and we're very happy to tell people about it. Now, as most of you guys might know, the actual architecture underlying both the Xbox and the PlayStation are very similar this time around, a lot more similar than previous generations. Pretty much every other time we've had massive disparities on either the CPU, the GPU, the memory, or something else. This time around the CPU and GPU are pretty much exactly the same, and he actually commented on this. The reality is that every time a generation changes, the playing field is leveled. We actually think that we're going to have superior graphic fidelity, but the whole value proposition has to be right. It's not just about graphic fidelity. What are the policies? What are our principles? What do we stand for, and how do we communicate it? He also said, when he was discussing game distribution, now obviously digital distribution has been really hot on the topic right now, both for the Xbox, the PlayStation 4, and everything else under the sun, as it turns out. Now, PCs, of course, have long enjoyed digital distribution because it just makes sense for most PC gamers. Retail stores have long since started to abandon the PC, and indeed, if I was to go into a local store, the shelf space for PCs would be ranging on negligible. Even my local supermarket, which is fairly big and does stock PS3 and Xbox 360 games, and even allows me to, say, pre-order a PS4 if I so desire, has very small shelf space, like the top 15 or 20, I think, best selling PC games. So, of course, most people are shifting towards, say, Steam or Origin or GOG or something similar. Anyway, in the same interview, he quoted, "I think the reality is this. Our digital business is growing fast, and we have incredibly strong partnerships with key retail partners as well. What we do try to do is offer a relatively level playing field and let the gamers decide. We're not trying to advantage them. We believe in consumer choice. It's clear that the vast majority of the people want to go down to GameStop, Best Buy. They don't want to buy it online right now. How that may change in the future is hard to predict. People might be quite surprised. I think physical games will be around a lot longer than some people think." EA have also been very clear they don't believe that physical games are going anywhere soon either, and we're talking once again on the game disc side of things. Meanwhile, as I've said previously, others aren't quite so unanimous in their voicings. Cliff Blazensky, who I'm sure doesn't really require an introduction, has also been outlining his thoughts and opinions, and he said, and I quote, "So here's what's going to happen now that Microsoft has largely matched Sony's well-played move at E3. This shift to digital is still going to happen for both," and he emphasised that. "It's still going to be slow and subtle. Suddenly, more DLC will be made available, more microtransactions will appear on day one, digital will hopefully be cheaper, and will have so many added bells and whistles that consumers with reliable enough bandwidth will have a hard time refusing the tasty downloadable edition over the disc-based one. I've said it before, if I worked at Microsoft, I would not only positively motivate users to go digital, but also offer them their own trading system in which it gives you more money for the game than GameStop, or sell used games for less than GameStop, including a Netflix-style mailing system, and move along your merry way by engaging consumers as opposed to treating them like criminals. Blazensky also pointed out something that both I have said and several others, and that is Microsoft messaging sucked. I honestly think Microsoft could have probably gotten away with a lot of the DRM if its policies had been very slightly changed and they hadn't been so just bloody useless at giving the message. And I don't say that as a fanboy of one system or the other, but it doesn't really take a genius to figure that something just had to be wrong at Microsoft's headquarters for them to actually think that people were going to be okay with the way they were wording this stuff, and Blazensky actually points this out as well. Years from now, college courses are going to be taught in proper messaging, and they're going to use the Microsoft's A3 delivery as the worst case scenario. Now, it's worth noting that Blazensky himself has been extremely opposed to used games. He's also been really opposed to piracy and all the other stuff that we've spoken about before, so I'm not going to go too heavily into that because I want to mostly keep this on digital versus physical. But he has said, just to reiterate, you cannot have a game and marketing budgets that are this high while also having used and rental games existing. The numbers do not work, people. Newsflash. This is why you're saying free-to-play models and microtransactions everywhere. The disc-based day one $60 model is crumbling. Those of you telling me that lower game budgets do not understand how silly you sound, right? End quote for the time being. So, what are my thoughts on this? Well, I could sort of see where both of them are coming from. The problem is, to get rid of the idea of getting rid of, let's say, discs. Now, PCs, and I use PCs for a moment, because I think PCs actually had a few fundamental shifts with the way they delivered games, right? The first is, if any of you guys were gamers back in the 90s on PC particularly, you'll notice that the boxes were really different. Now you get the DVD style / Blu-ray style cases, right? The really small, crappy manuals, and that's pretty much it. There are the odd exception, mostly of really hard to understand games such as, say, Microsoft Flight Simulator, that type of thing. Generally, now games are in a DVD type of case. Back in the day, this is not, well, the case, if you excuse the pun. Games back then used to be in cardboard boxes, and by golly gosh, you felt like you bought something when you got these things. I mean, you had manuals that were basically bigger than an engineer's, instruction book. You had art often, you would have serial number, of course, and all the other bits and gubbins that you'd expect, as well as a jeweled case. Often a couple, because back then CDs and DVDs weren't really the standard, so a lot of the time it was CDs, and a couple of CDs since installs were 2 or 3 gigs, and that was really fun over, say, 4 CDs, just to give you an example. And in addition to all of that, you would sometimes get maps with it, you would get, say, instructions. In addition to the game manual, you would also get like hints and tips and quick stuff, which would basically give you a really brief layout of all the keyboard controls and mouse controls. Because the internet was not prevalent and not every single person knew someone who had it, it would be that oftentimes a FAQ was included of what happens if your PC doesn't load because of X, as well as various phone numbers and so forth. Then, of course, the shift changed, the momentum changed. Back around the days of, say, Half-Life 2, most of the cardboard box type of giveaways had been pretty much eliminated. And at this point, this is like early 2000s, you were looking at basically the DVD-style case, and if you were to open that sucker up, you would get a basic manual, and it would pretty much say you'd also maybe have like a warranty card and a few other bits and pieces saying if you are from this region of the world, contact this person if your game doesn't work. If you're from this region of the world, contact this person. Otherwise, it would basically web your rules. So there was a definite shift there, and a lot of people, including myself, said, "Oh, I really miss the cardboard boxes." Now, the reason we missed them, despite the fact that they were bloody inconvenient to store, was simple. They looked cool. It's that simple. It was a collector's type of thing. You know, I had this box where it had all the Quakes and Dooms in it, the really early Quakes, like Quake 1 and Quake 2, and all the, you know, Dooms, like Doom 1, Doom 2, so forth. And it was really cool. It was this really awesome official box from id, and it had all this cool artwork. It was actually a huge box. It was massive. And one of my friends as well, when he came back from the States, because he went there on a holiday when he was younger, obviously, he came back with his Bullfrog box, and it had all the magic carpets in it, Theme Hospital, Theme Park, all these other games. It was really awesome. The bottom line is, however, although people bitched about it, we said, well, we're paying the same price for the same bloody package, for less packaging, and why are our manuals now basically the size of, you know, a little leaflet? And suddenly, the bitching stopped. And the reason is because people just said, well, you know what, storing those other games, it was a bitch, I'm just going to go with the convenience. And I admit, people did want the physical box because they said it looked cool. And basically, a lot of the time, developers and publishers were using the cool box to basically sell the game, right? This massive-ass box on the shelf. But the reality is, people eventually just said, forget it, you know what, I'd rather have the shelf room. And then, of course, we had the shift to digital. Now, this once again was met with some resistance. However, despite the fact that even I personally hated Steam when it first came out, it was slow. Even though I had like the fastest connection available, at least in my region at the time, which I think was 512 KB. I know that was a rip-roaring speed, but hey, it was the fastest that I could get at the time, and then it went up to 1 meg. But even so, Steam was horrible, it was slow, it sometimes crashed, and the word begrudging when I installed 1.6 in Steam. However, ultimately, I said, yeah, you know what, at least it keeps the bloody game up to date. And I just dealt with it. And now, if someone said to me, would I like PC gaming without Steam? I'd say, well, I don't know. Would I like to play a game without a screen? Would I like to try and play an FPS without a keyboard and mouse? No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't really want to go with anything other than digital now. There are a couple of games I have bought physical copies for. Why? Because ultimately speaking, they give me a code that I could put on for Steam, and sometimes the physical copy has just been a little smidgen cheaper, which is somewhat ironic, and we've spoken about this before. It basically just depends on what the publisher can manage to convince Steam to sell the item for compared to a retail store. In other words, they have to be competitive, because obviously otherwise retail stores would be pretty pissed if, say, Steam were outselling them. Now obviously as well you've got, well, the Steam sales and everything else, which I'm expecting to start very soon. So what about for consoles? I think at the moment the problem is that the PlayStation, for example, I'm talking about PSN, up until recently, some of the prices have taken the piss. I'll just be completely blunt. You know, a couple of times I was like, oh, you know what, I might as well buy a digital. Okay, forget that. It's like £10 more expensive. And it's not how to sell the item to you. You're just going to buy the physical copy. Because, ultimately speaking, it just doesn't make sense for me to not do that. I mean, I'd rather own the physical copy in some instances anyway, but when you're charging me not only the same, but actually more, well, it doesn't really make sense not to. Now, one of the issues that both consoles have, and I do mean both, is the hard drive space. Now, 500 gigabytes to me is piddly. The problem is that both systems have packed so much stuff into the console that, honestly speaking, something had to give, and in this case it had to be the hard drive space, because obviously it represents the best price / performance / size ratio. It doesn't take anyone of immense intellect, however, to realise that mathematics just don't add up. Now, Sony did go the route of saying to you, okay, you put in whatever hard drive you want into the system, but we're just going to give you 500 gigabytes as a base. Now, to be fair, that's pretty much what they did with most of the PlayStation models. If you want to, for example, one of my friends got a 1 terabyte, I think it was 1 terabyte drive, and put it on his PS3. You could do that. You can put in SSD, although the performance, as far as I understand it, isn't a huge increase, although it is a little bit faster. Compared to the Xbox. Now, I didn't like the Xbox's model because I didn't like the fact that they were very, you have to use this particular drive. It's a pain in the ass, right? Because we know what happens if you open up the drive. Ultimately, it's the same as a laptop drive, I believe it was. So I just didn't like that. And I think that will, ironically enough, hurt retail sales, digital sales a little bit. However, I honestly feel that it's not going to be too long before developers and publishers, as well as Microsoft and Sony, say, you know what, let's start phasing out the middleman here. Let's just make this a hell of a lot easier. It makes things a hell of a lot easier as well in terms of stock. Now, I'll give you guys an example. I was silly, and I didn't pre-order The Last of Us. Why? Well, I honestly couldn't tell you because I don't really think I had a reason. I just kept putting it off for whatever reason. I think it's mostly just laziness on my part. And then I just happened to realise that, oh, actually it's coming out tomorrow, isn't it? Bollocks. And so I knew at that point there was absolutely no way I could order it in time because obviously, you know, one day is just not anywhere near enough notice. And so I decided just to walk from basically my gym, which is a couple of minutes walk, to the nearest retail store, which happens to be a big-ass shop, big-ass retail shop that sells food and everything else, so basically a supermarket. And I happened to notice that they did have one copy of The Last of Us remaining, and I purchased that. So, the thing about digital, however, of course, is there are no finite limits. Now, obviously, server space and server speeds are an issue. However, to be honest with you, we're getting so much redundancy now, especially with, of course, the latest news that Microsoft are going to be basically spending, I believe it was 700 million, or just slightly under that, shade under that, on their Windows Azure platform, which, of course, ultimately is what's going to be powering the Xbox One in terms of the downloadable and so forth. I don't really think we have to worry about that. So, I think that in those type of convenience and everything else, it will start to phase out. Microsoft, of course, do want this, because, well, it's not easy for you to trade in a digital game. In fact, you cannot trade in a digital game. You cannot do it on the PlayStation either. And of course, you can't really do it on the PC. That isn't to say you cannot gift someone a game, for example, on Steam. I could, for example, buy you a copy of X. On the other hand, I may have a spare copy of X, and I could give that away, which is obviously one of the reasons that I do competitions on RGT sometimes to give you guys games. I'll just give you guys either a spare copy of one that I already have, or I'll buy one specifically for the competition and then give it away. Either way works. So, I think this is going to be a case of, as Cliffy B said, it's going to be a case of you don't realise that you're doing it, and they're going to make it slowly more appealing, and I don't necessarily know if I'll miss it, if I'm honest. I mean, obviously those of us with crap internet connections are going to be affected. However, I have a 120 MB connection. I am by no means the only person who has that in the world. I'm sure there are several viewers, probably several hundred viewers, who have faster connections than I do. On the other hand, I'm sure there's a great many of you who have slower connections than I do. Amata, for example, has a piss-poor internet connection. I think hers is like 10 or 20 megabytes. Spooner Kipper, I think, has 100 as well. I'm not sure what Murasaki's is. I think he has 60. I'm not sure about that one. I can't actually remember honestly what he told me he did, but, you know, whatever. So, obviously it depends what areas you're from. If you're from a city, you're obviously going to be doing a hell of a lot better than if you're in the middle of the boondocks. Not that there's anything wrong with that. You could choose where you live, and obviously there are sacrifices for living in the city. For example, I cannot simply, you know, enjoy the country air. On the other hand, it also means, of course, that we do have better internet connections. That is not always the case. Also, the problem, of course, of DRM and all these other bits and pieces is, of course, if your internet goes out, you don't have access to games. However, I have no issues with buying your games and then that's it. Okay, so digital, you activated the game, that's yours, done. I had no issues with that as long as the 24-hour check isn't in place. Anyway, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. You can either comment or you can go to facebook.com/redgamingtech, or you can just click on the descriptive thing below and it will take you right there. As a warning, guys, I've gotten a couple of messages recently. I haven't realised I've received them on RGT, Facebook. If you don't hear from me within like 24 hours, message again and just put like a dot or a question mark or something there. It's not that I'm ignoring you. There are 3 or 4 of us that work on the channel, and although I am usually the one who reads the messages, sometimes I am not. So if someone else reads it, they may forget to tell me, and so all I can do is just, you know, just check infrequently and just see if, you know, if there is something for me. You can also message, and in the title of the message or at the start of the message you can say Paul or Crimson Rain, and it will also come to me as well. Anyway, I'm going to get going. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. It's fairly brief. Well, at least for my videos it's brief. I will hopefully see you soon. Take care and bye for now.